The prophet Joel wants us to weep and wail and mourn like we've never done before. Hey there, welcome to Equipped. I'm your host, Mario Escobedo. This channel is for you if you want to deepen your understanding of the Bible. That could be for personal spiritual edification or because you want to share the Bible more effectively with others. So on this channel, I do Bible studies as well as teachings on how to study the Bible effectively. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. This video is part of a series on the book of the prophet Joel, a powerful, powerful book of prophecy. And I'm going passage by passage in the book of Joel. Right now, we're in the first passage, which is Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. And in this video, I'm going to look at three verses, verses 8, 9, and 10. Let's look at what those verses say. And what you see here on the screen right now is the passage, Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. And you'll notice that I've divided the passage up into four paragraphs or four sections. And this is how I do my Bible study. And what I've done here is that what you see highlighted in blue in this first paragraph right here, that for me is the main idea for that first paragraph. Highlighted in blue in the second paragraph is the main idea for the second paragraph. And highlighted in blue here in verses 8 through 10, that for me is the main idea for this third paragraph right here. So let's read the third paragraph and then I'll read what I've chosen as the main idea for that paragraph. And this is how it reads. Mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. The fields are ruined, the ground is dried up, the grain is destroyed, the new wine is dried up, the olive oil fails. So when I read that paragraph and I think about what is the main idea of that paragraph, it's this that I've highlighted in blue. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. Now, let's look at these verses a bit more closely to see what it is that the prophet Joel wants us to understand from these verses. Beginning in verse 8, we see that the prophet Joel is calling the people to mourn, but it's a very specific kind of mourning that he's calling them to. He says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. And what the prophet Joel here is telling the people that he wants them to express and experience the type of mourning and lamenting and sadness that a young virgin would experience if her fiance or newlywed husband, if he had just died. Imagine the despair that this young lady would feel. That's the type of mourning that the prophet Joel is calling the people to experience and to express. And just imagine that. It's a deep, sorrowful type of mourning because this young lady has lost the man that she thought she was going to be with for the rest of her life. They're starting off as a young couple, or they're about to get married, or if they're engaged, and all of a sudden this young man, he dies. The grief that this young woman would experience, that's the type of grief that the prophet Joel is calling the people to express as a result of this massive locust invasion that he's been talking about in verses 2 through 7. So this is a deep mourning that the prophet Joel is calling the people to express. And then he goes into telling us what it is that's happened that is going to cause that mourning like a virgin in sackcloth. He tells us in verse 9, grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. Now this is important because the grain offerings and the drink offerings were part of what the priests would offer every day as they would offer sacrifices at the altar. So we had every day, we learned this from Exodus chapter 29, starting in about verse 38, I believe it is, that the priests are supposed to offer a lamb that is 1 year old. And this is every day. And they offer this once in the morning and once in the evening. So every day, the priests, are offering this type of sacrifice. And what accompanies the sacrifice of this 1 year old lamb? Well, it's the grain offering and the drink offering. So essentially what the prophet is saying here is that since the grain offerings and the drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord, the priests cannot fulfill their priestly duties to the fullest extent. The Lord had commanded the people of Israel in Exodus 29 that part of the sacrifice that they were offering every day, that 1-year-old lamb, part of it was the grain offerings and the drink offerings. And so if the priests cannot offer grain and drink offerings, they cannot offer the sacrifice as completely as had been that they'd been told to offer the sacrifice. So as a result, of course, the priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord, because they cannot carry out their priestly functions. And it was through those sacrifices, those daily sacrifices, that was part of what kept the people of Israel in right relationship with God. And so if they can't offer these daily sacrifices with the grain offerings and the drink offerings on a daily basis, then their relationship with God, between the nation and God, that relationship is in jeopardy. And so it's no wonder then that the priests are in mourning, not just because they can't fulfill their priestly duties, but because the relationship between God and his people is in jeopardy if they can't continue to fulfill those priestly duties. Now, as we going on into verse 10, notice how it says, the fields are ruined. Oh, sorry about that. Right here. The fields are ruined. The ground is dried up. The grain is destroyed. The new wine is dried up, and the olive oil fails. So again, like Joel has been doing in the first 7 verses, we see the extent of this devastation. Just everything, absolutely everything has been ruined. And notice, verse 10 ties into verse 9. The priests can't offer grain offerings and drink offerings. Why? Well, because everything in verse 10, that's what the elements would have been. The wine, the grain, the olive oil, those 3 elements would have been used in preparing the grain offerings and the drink offerings. The priests can't do that. And so it's just utter devastation, the absolute worst devastation that they could have imagined. Now, I'm going to do a little side note here, and I'm going to do a follow-up video because personally, I don't like the way the NIV has translated verse 10. It says the fields are ruined, the ground is dried up. And I take issue with that translation right there. I'm going to do a follow-up video to give my explanations. I prefer the way the ESV translates this verse, where it says the fields are destroyed, the ground mourns. Notice the difference between the ESV and the NIV. The ground mourns versus the ground is dried up. Again, I'm going to do a follow-up video, and I'll show you that verse in the Hebrew and why it is that I prefer the ESV's translation over the NIV's translation. So looking at these verses, verses 8 through 10, we see further description from the prophet Joel on the extent of the devastation of this locust invasion. And for that one paragraph, this one paragraph right here, I think that what best summarizes that paragraph is where Joel says, the priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. So it's utter devastation to the point that the priests cannot carry out their priestly responsibilities in carrying out that daily sacrifice that would include drink offerings and grain offerings. And because of that, they mourn. They can't do what they're supposed to do. So continue going on to the next video in this series. You can see that little explanation that I give on Joel chapter 1 verse 10, or you can go on to the next video, that last section in Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 12. That's kind of the concluding paragraph right there in that passage. And also, again, consider subscribing. That way you're always up to date on these teachings. Thank you so much for joining me. God bless.